Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT Show. I'm John Drummond, and I'm your host for the next 60 minutes. Again, I want to thank you for supporting the show and also Indie Live. You'll see there are more and more shows, and I'm pleased to tell you tonight that in the last stats, it looks like Indie Live has been viewed by 1.3 million viewers, 1.3 million viewings of Indie Live and its shows. Now, I hasten to add, all of these folks weren't watching the TNT show necessarily, but the fact that Indie Live has that sort of reach and that sort of impact is pretty impressive, particularly bearing in mind that there are various, dare I say it, BBC Scotland shows which consistently fail to get as many people watching as there are watching this show tonight. So if you're upset by media coverage of political events, and you're not alone, by the way, and you've watched journalism being junked in favour of stenography or rehashed news releases, if you're looking for an alternative voice, well, you found that Indie Live is here for you, and you can have a chance to be there for us if you can be kindly supporting the crowdfunder. You'll see the details on the screen, or you can find it on the Indie Live website. You know, it's been another great day for British democracy. John Simmons, who's the head of the major Labour think tank, wants people smugglers, that is, criminals, put in a barge and sent to Scotland. So far, there's been no word from the Labour leader, so we must assume that he, and it would be reasonable to assume, since he hasn't come back and rejected that statement, that he agrees with it, which would be gross, to put it mildly. Also, we're still waiting to hear back from Stephen Flynn, who was our guest last week, and Stephen said that he would look into who in the SNP is responsible for running the Constitutional Convention, which has been promised. And you may recall that we discussed that concept with Stephen Flynn last week. If you're not familiar with that discussion, you can find it on YouTube, as you can find all of the 150 odd shows that we've done, TNT shows that we've done. You can catch up on all of these on YouTube. And we're hoping to hear back from Stephen Flynn and or his team in that regard. We're also hoping to hear back soon, hopefully, from Jamie Hepburn. You may recall that I asked him on the show if he would be kind enough to contact the First Minister with a view to inviting him on the show. So we look forward to hearing from Jamie and from Stephen. Tonight we'll be talking to another excellent guest. We'll be talking to Rhoda Meek. Now, Rhoda is joining us from Tiree. And among the subjects we'll be covering are island living and life as a software developer. And she will be taking your questions live. There's still time to get your questions considered. You'll find the details on the screen. Now, as you know, TNT stands for The Nation Talks. So in many respects, this is your show. We're live and we're free. So no license, no problem. Now to our guest tonight. Welcome, Rhoda. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, that's a great pleasure, a great pleasure. Begin by telling us a little bit about Tiree.
Oh, the Isle of Tiree, the best island of them all. We are, if you head up towards Oban and you take a left and you keep going for about 4 hours, you reach Tiree and our neighbouring island of Coll. We're about 4 miles by 9, 4 by 11. Sort of opinions differ, but we're pretty small. And the last census said that we had a population, kind of static population of about 650. We're known as an island that you get on the shipping forecast. So people have often heard about Tiree because it gets mentioned. And we are also well known for our windsurfing and our beaches.
Excellent.
Among other things.
Amongst other things, you know. Well, where does the name Tiree come from? Is it Celtic or Gaelic or what is it?
Ooh, now you're putting me on the spot. I believe there's a couple. Oh no, I think it's Chia. It would come from Cheer, which would be land. And I've heard it said that it was Cheer Iugh, so it might have come from you, as the tree. But I could be wrong there. My father would be the one to know that. I imagine he'll be sitting twitching.
Well, if he's watching tonight, he can tell us. Are there many trees on Tiree?
You get the occasional palm tree. They do fairly well. It's windy and their roots are in sand, so they're quite happy. Other than that, most things kind of peek over a wall and then change their minds and turn into a bush.
Yeah, we've all seen that. Oh my word, you know. Do you get rather ferocious weather there from time to time?
From time to time, it can get quite interesting. Yes, we get a lot of good drying days, as we call them, and of course we had an earthquake just a couple of weeks ago as well. The
Really?
earthquake Mull reached Tyree, and most houses rattled. Yeah.
Oh my word. Are you
Yeah,
are
it was a
you on some sort of fault
3.3.
line?
Mull is, I believe, and so they had one of their bigger ones for quite a while. I think it hit
Oh,
3.3 on the Richter
gracious.
scale, and it was
My
felt in
word.
Tyree.
I must say, and we were talking about a small island. I guess you probably agree with me. It's a small island, uh, uh, but your internet connection is fantastic. I mean, there are people in towns right now watching you, Rhoda, with envy, if not jealousy.
Don't jinx it. We're doing quite well right now. Um, we're really fortunate in Tidy, actually. We have a community broadband company. We've got a few fiber cabinets now, but by no means enough to reach everyone in Tidy, and most of us are still at the end of an old copper line. So the Tidy community broadband company takes fiber in, and then we load balance it, and it's bounced across the island in a series of shortwave radio networks,
Oh,
which is
really?
it's pretty cool. I don't do it. Someone else who's far more technically talented than I am does it, but it's great, and yes, you get a good connection.
Yeah. I mean, but you are involved in the broadband committee, a
I
grouping of
chair it. Yes, I
you
do.
chair it. Okay. So you're responsible for its quality, which is clearly outstanding. I mean, I've got
I suppose the buck has to stop somewhere, doesn't it? I won't take credit for it, but I have to take responsibility. Yeah.
now you're a software developer, is that right?
I think most software developers worth their salt would cringe slightly. I'm a web developer, so I do a lot of the front end, building websites, and focusing on how they look, how you would interact with a website, and how a user would use it, what it looks like, how we structure the information, and the sort of back end bits that involve more in-depth coding and databases, which is
Yeah.
what I kind of think of as development. That sits with someone else. I shouldn't be allowed near that. No.
Well, I bought some tickets for a continental rail journey this week, and when I was on the site, it said to me, "Do you want to have a return?" And I thought, "Yes, I do want to have a return." So I bought a return, and then I got a signal back saying, "Here are your tickets on the app," and there was only the outgoing journey. And I thought, oh, maybe I've downloaded it wrong then, because I've also got a receipt for a return. So I've got, for my wife and I, I've got two tickets. I was expecting four. So then I got a disturbing email that said, "Don't you want to come back?" And I thought, oh, sugar. This is not finger trouble on my part. They genuinely believe that I didn't buy a return, even though I've got a receipt to that effect. You know, is that the sort of thing that you can help with or prevent?
Oh, so what I would be doing in that instance probably is rather than the gubbins of what went wrong in the back end, I would be looking at how we could have made it easier for you to understand what happened and then fix it without having to kind of get the email. So that feedback loop from the how you've interacted with the website to how we make it better and easier to understand would be mine.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
but in some of the consulting work I do, I would then maybe take that issue that you'd reported, if you'd reported it to me, and I would explain it to an engineer and then explain it backwards and forwards until we got to a solution.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to the time that somebody actually gets involved because I have to say, apart from that glitch, everything worked perfectly. I was hugely impressed. You know, maybe I shouldn't be because people have spent many consistent hours making sure that these things work well, and I'm sure you're part of that. You mentioned earlier when we were offline that you had some clients in the US as well.
Yeah, for the last 11 years now, I've been working remotely from Tyree, and I have done some contracting for tech startups in the US doing kind of technical customer support for software products. So again, when a customer fails to buy a return ticket or thinks they have and something's gone wrong with the app, I would be the person they'd talk to, and I
Right.
would then do the troubleshooting and then refer it up the line to someone who could poke at the code.
So, I mean, to me, it's just a fascinating business, that all of that can be done remotely. I mean, you can do this from Tyree, you can do it from wherever. All you need is a decent internet connection, I assume.
Yes, that's it.
I'm also interested because my family, a lot of my family, my son and his kids live in Portugal, and they have specific arrangements for, what's it they call software nomads, to attract people to go and live in Portugal. Specific tax arrangements and all sorts of inducements to persuade people who can operate from anywhere to head for Portugal.
Yeah, digital nomads, I think they call them.
Digital nomads. That's the term. Yeah. Do you come across many digital nomads in your business?
I have, yeah. There's quite a number. The companies that I've worked for in the States, particularly, I've worked with brilliant designers who are traveling across the US in a camper van, or traveling around various, doing a world tour. Yeah, absolutely. It's really quite popular because if you can work from anywhere, why not work from anywhere?
Yeah, yeah. It sounds very attractive. You get your camper van out there and head out to the wild beyond, and just stop occasionally. Again, back to the issue about where can you get a decent connection. But I suppose nowadays you can get a decent connection almost anywhere, can you?
Increasingly so, yeah. I mean, if the internet connection goes down here, we've got a 4G mast that I can get enough 4G from to work quite comfortably as well. So, I
Is
think
that
increasingly the opportunities are growing for
yeah,
places like the islands in terms of
yeah.
connectivity.
Yeah, I saw a Netflix program about this couple who were buying shares and stuff, and it was all done from their camper van. And they were buying masses and masses of shares because the share price was going up. It was being manipulated because a whole bunch of sort of hedge funds had shorted the stock. So the result was that if you forced them to buy the stock, which they were prepared to pay almost any price, stop the price going up. And of course, every time they bought it, the price went up even more. It's fascinating to see hedge funds being put in the predicament that they force everyone else into from time to time. So you're also a crofter, is that right?
It is, yes. I call myself a trainee crofter. I'm not sure if I'll ever become fully fledged, but I'm trying.
So what do you have on your croft? Do you have animals or?
Yes, I've got animals. I've got about 80 sheep. Half of them are breeding ewes, and the
Oh,
other
really?
half are young replacement stock or wethers, so castrated males that I bring on for mutton every year. I take them to about 30 months. And then I have 4 cows and another 2 or 3 sort of younger cows that haven't calved yet.
So you've got all of that husbandry to do.
I do, yes. And at this time of year, they're being fed. They're all being fed every day, going out, and they get their sweeties. They get their little bit of energy boost.
So I mean, I assume that you have to buy in the feedstock and stuff, do you?
Yes, you have to import all of that.
So
The
that's a cost up front, isn't it? The
Yeah, I
feed,
mean, it's a cost up front for most anyone really in agriculture will be buying in feeding ahead of the winter. I guess, in the islands, we end up potentially paying slightly more to have it delivered. I don't think that's so much the case with feeding for me anyway, because of the volume I buy. But we certainly see a lot of issues with just getting anything to the islands. You're always paying more for it.
yeah. Isn't it swings and roundabouts though, in the sense that you can't live in an attractive place like you do? I mean, there has to be a downside to it somewhere. Otherwise, the whole island would be overpopulated.
Yeah, I don't think there's much risk of overpopulation. We've got quite the opposite problem. I don't know. I guess it's that kind of describing it as a choice. it's,
Yeah,
for a lot of us, it's not a choice. It's where we're from. It's where our families are from. It's where you're kind of linked to and connected to.
yeah,
And so, you don't really think about there being another option. Um, I guess the one of the frustrations for me, if you take, for example, the surcharge that you get on Highland deliveries. So I'm sure a lot of people listening to this, if they
yeah.
live sort of north of Perth, you'll suddenly discover that, oh, we don't send to this area, or we'll send to this area for an extra 50 quid. And you can then sort of it's like that, but on skates for the islands. When people could just use Royal Mail, but it doesn't suit a lot of the large companies on economies of scale. So there's an island tax there.
What do you do about financing? Because I assume that you've got all that upfront cost before you get paid. So how does the financing of a croft work? Do you have a very generous banker? How does it work?
That's an excellent question. The main goal is to break even, I think, for me most of the time. Um, I've built it up slowly, and um, carefully, I guess. I keep my inputs as low as possible. So the animals that I raise are mainly native breed animals that need less input, less concentrate feeding, and everything stays outside. Um, there are subsidies available for crofters, so you can get subsidies in return for looking after ground in a particular way, um, and so that helps.
Yeah.
But you just have to your income comes when you sell your animals at a particular time of year, and then you've just got to budget and work out, just balance the books in terms of the feeding that you buy versus the animals that you're selling, and try and get the balance right, like you do with any checkbook.
Have your whole family been crofters from way back, or are you the first?
I'm no, we have. Well, this is the house that my great great grandfather built, and he built it on our croft, and he was one of the first crofters. So he was part of the sort of land agitation movement that started crofting as a concept, and so we have been crofting in this corner of Coolus entirely ever since you could. But I was born and brought up in Edinburgh. My father was born and brought up here. He moved away for work. And so I was born and brought up in Edinburgh. And it's only been in the last 11 years that I've been able to move back and properly start crofting and getting things back in order. So that's why I call myself a trainee.
What were the biggest challenges for you when you started crofting? Looking back,
Um, oh, my own ignorance, I think. It's incredible the amount of knowledge I think I've gained over the last 11 years, and it's incredible how much I still have to go. But I mean, the biggest challenges was the learning curve. It was simply the learning curve when you're not brought up with an agricultural background. There's so much assumed knowledge in the crofting world that you've kind of it's in with the bricks and you've grown up with it, and so you know. And I had this really weird position of knowing a lot of it, but didn't actually know it in practice. So there was a lot of learning, um, a lot of dealing with the fact that nature can be very cruel. That takes, I don't think you ever get used to that, seeing animals die, or, my first lambing season, I think, was probably my worst to date, because you think when you do training and you help other people, but until you're left on your own in the dark at 2 o'clock in the morning, you don't actually know anything.
oh my. Somebody's asking if you've retained your Gaelic. In Gaelic, you've kept the language, have you?
I've been very fortunate to. Like I say, I was born and brought up in Edinburgh, but my father is a native Gaelic speaker. He's actually a retired professor of Celtic languages. So
Ah,
keeping, keeping Gaelic alive was very important to him. My mother's from Bristol, but she learnt Gaelic when she met my father. She's very good at languages. And so my sister and I were brought up with Gaelic. And then we went into the first intake in Gaelic medium education in Edinburgh, in Tollcross. And so I then did Gaelic all the way up to sixth year studies.
Oh, great.
So yeah, I
And
was fortunate.
how many
And
Gaelic
then
speakers are there on the island?
In Tiree, that's a good question. We've just had some sort of worrying numbers, I guess, that we're down to fewer than 30%, I think, of
Uh,
the island are now native Gaelic speakers. That's something that is concerning. We're losing our older speakers. We're losing the speakers that have the beautiful turns of phrase, and the vocabulary that maybe we don't have now. So that's challenging, but I'm doing my best to learn as much of the Tiree dialect. It has its own dialect as I can.
well, maybe they could help too. Maybe recording some of the stuff that they do, and because I mean, you're right. Once it's gone, it's gone. I mean, it's so hard to recover once that incredible source is gone. I mean, and why is it going? It's going because people get old, and that's it.
Oh, so that is another huge question. So I'm going to answer with generalizations. The the challenge I think across Scotland has been kind of twofold. In my father's when my father was at school, for example, he's mid 70s. It wasn't at all encouraged to speak Gaelic. In fact, you'd be belted for speaking Gaelic. And so the prevailing attitude was that if you didn't you needed to learn English to progress, basically. Gaelic would never get you anywhere. And so there's this big generational gap where Gaelic wasn't passed on in families. And a lot of people very much wish they had it. Gaelic medium education arrived, and children were starting to be taught through the medium of Gaelic about 30 years ago. But the question is whether that gap has been too much to fill, and we've lost that middle generation of speakers.
Yeah,
And so, whilst we're teaching it in schools, community usage has dropped. English is very dominant, and as an increasing number of people migrate into the islands who are not native Gaelic speakers, you end up with a natural dilution of that language, and so it's quite hard for it um, to sort of maintain a strength.
mm. Someone has just said that Gaelic has 103 words related to rain. Does that sound right?
I don't know all 103, but it wouldn't surprise me. There's a whole lot of types of rain you can get in Gaelic for sure. Yeah.
But they're also pointing out that Tiree has the record for sunshine hours.
It is, yes, it is the sunniest place in Britain on a quite a regular basis, I do believe.
Really? So the does that mean that the weather patterns pass over the island? In other words, because they're not meeting mountains immediately, the clouds just drift right across, and is that the way it works? I mean, I don't know anything about weather.
Either
Right?
way, I mean, we're quite close to sort of tail end of the Gulf Stream, and the mountains and Mulls tend to sort of catch, I think, the worst of that weather, and we just sit in this nice little microcosm. Although that said, I often say it's like the little girl with the curl. You know, people come on holiday, and in the summer they see these beautiful idyllic beaches. Um, but you know, the little girl with the curl, when she was good, she was very, very good. But when she was bad, it was absolutely horrid. And you know, 50-mile-an-hour hailstones are no fun.
I know. I was honestly, when you mentioned being up at 2 in the morning lambing, I had this picture that the weather might not be kind when you were doing that. And
Rarely is, yes.
oh, gracious. Oh my word. How the heck did you cope? Were you on your own?
Yeah, I'm often on my own at 2 o'clock in the morning when something goes wrong lambing. It's just the way it is. I have good people around me. I've learned everything I know. I've learned from the other crofters around me who've been really generous with their time and their knowledge and their expertise. And if I'm ever in a real bind, there's always someone who'll pick up the phone even at 2 o'clock in the morning. You know? And I do the same for them. And I think it's one of the really special things about living in a community like this and being part
Yeah,
of a crofting community is that we all know that sometimes you just can't do it on your own.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, it sounds like a challenging life you have there. But you seem to be enjoying it.
I
I
love
get the
it. I love
impression
the
that you are.
variety.
Yeah. Because there are people, I'm sure, in the audience tonight who are on this sort of 9 to 5 treadmill, and they're probably thinking, I wouldn't mind getting up occasionally at 2 in the morning to do a bit of
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge that we often have in the islands, certainly, it is that there's this two sides of the coin. There's looking at it and thinking, oh, that's the part, the good life. It feels like the good life. It looks like the good life. I'll have a bit of that, even if it's sometimes uncomfortable. And then there's the other reality, which is that you're pulling together quite a lot of different income strands, for example. So even though I contract, those contracts aren't always there. I'm not currently in contract, so I'm running two businesses and a croft, and chairing the community development trust, and you end up doing an awful lot. So this idea that time stands still, um, for many of us, it actually moves really fast in this
Yeah.
context because you have so many competing priorities and such a small community to draw resources from.
You mentioned the community development arrangements. What is that? Tell us a bit about that.
Tidy has a community development trust, and that trust is tasked with improving the lot, I guess, of Tiree and undertaking projects that are important for the infrastructure of the island and the future of the island. We have our community wind turbine. She's called
Ah,
Tilly, and she's been running since, oh, I'm going to forget the year, but for a long time now, turning and feeding back into the grid and earning money for the community. And that goes back into what's called a windfall fund, and that fund funds community projects. So we were able to run the community broadband as a subsidiary of that. We built and run our own fuel station. We built a fishing harbour. We're building business units. That's the type of thing that we
mm.
do. So there's staff in the trust, and then there's a board of directors as well. And our next big project we're hoping is going to be housing, because housing in the Scottish Islands is a massive, massive challenge.
Why is that? Is that because of the lack of materials or finance or both?
It's no, finance partly. If you take my village here in Tiree, it's called Curlis, and it has 50% second home ownership.
Ah,
And the island as a whole has 46. So that means that essentially half of the houses here are not lived in year round. A percentage of those are short-term holiday lets that are used, tourists use them in the summer, and a bigger percentage are actually houses that people don't live in apart from when they want a holiday. And what's happened is that has, one, it's taken houses off the market for people
yeah,
who want to live here permanently. And the second thing that it does is that it pushes up the house prices.
yeah.
So it is now a housing market. The market is dropping back, as we're seeing in many parts of the country now, and we'll see what happens there. But basically, the market price for houses is far above what someone on a median income in Tiree who wants to stay here with kids and is maybe working between a number of different seasonal jobs. It's far above what they can afford. And so what we're seeing is people either having to move away or not being able to move here to take up jobs on the basis that they can't get housing. And you really can't get hold of long-term rental accommodation is like hen's teeth. And it's a real problem. We've got, the care home needs staff, schools need staff, and those staff come needing houses. So that's the challenge, and that's why we're looking at, as a community, building houses that can be affordable housing and be long-term rental options.
Uh, well, one solution that comes to mind, and I speak from a position of deep ignorance on this, but I have heard it mooted, is why isn't there a tax on
Mm.
second homes or homes that are unoccupied for long periods? I know that other countries do that. How do you feel about that?
Well, I know that there's going to be a doubling of the council tax on second homes, I believe, is coming in. It's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out in practice. In principle, I'm in favour of it. More money should stay in the communities where money is earned. So more of the benefit of tourism, more of the benefit of the beauty of the island should stay in it. It's the community who should benefit most. And so, in theory, an increase in council tax for these properties makes sense, in the same way that having a database and licenses for short-term letting accommodation makes sense, in order to know how many you have, and to know what state they're in. That makes sense. But again, I think the law of unintended consequences kicks in when you come into rural areas and small areas like this. So, as an example, one of the projects I run under my social enterprise is that we run essentially an island Airbnb. And we've got well over 100 properties now that we list on that. And the idea being that the booking commission goes back into the islands, and that we use it, and we reinvest in the islands. And what has been interesting doing that is that we're definitely seeing a drop in the number of houses that are going to be short-term lets. And anecdotally, that's because people don't want to jump through the hoops, or because the house isn't good enough state, or they maybe let, but they don't really need to, and this seems like a lot of hassle. And so there's been a portion of that market has dropped away. So the question is, what do we do there? If the market drops and those houses go back onto the market, prices drop, and people can buy them locally and live here, brilliant. I think the reality, and I think it's going to be the same with the reality of that situation, I think, is actually that people are just going to keep them, or sell them to someone who keeps it as a second home. So they won't let it; they'll just keep it as a second home. Our tourism industry needs tourist beds. If we don't have beds for tourists in short-term holiday lets, then we undermine our tourist economy. We also need houses for the people who are going to serve the coffee and run those tourist businesses. So it's this really complicated balancing act, and I don't think we're doing. I think there's a lot of tools, and I think there's been good discussion about it. And I think that used the right way, things like double council tax and licensing is important. But I don't think we're getting down to the nuance that's needed for island communities like ours.
Yeah.
And the double council tax one is interesting to me, because I think, again, for people who are still buying properties, in the knowledge that all over the country this is an issue,
Yeah.
if you're still buying a second home with no intention of letting it out, even on short-term lets, then you have enough money that a double council tax is a drop in the ocean.
Yeah, of
honestly.
course it is. Yeah.
So
Isn't part of the
that's it.
problem?
It's complicated and shades of grey. That's my answer.
Yeah. Isn't part of the problem that unless you have specialised tourist accommodation, you end up with multi-purpose tourist accommodation, i.e., exactly the situation that it's not there aren't two separate markets for housing, as it were. I mean, for example, if you had a hotel, now it might not be viable if it's only occupied a short time during the year, but some sort of specialised tourist accommodation, so that market didn't depend entirely upon people letting their properties for some weeks during this. That might be one solution. In other words, there's a tax, not necessarily the council, but a tax of some form, maybe centrally or otherwise, that pays for specialised tourist accommodation. So that would not have an impact on the people who live locally and would like to live locally and look after the care homes and all the rest of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some really interesting discussions to be had about how you square this particular circle. I mean, we have 3 hotels in Tiree, only one of which is open in the winter, for example. And I mean, I think a really interesting conversation that needs to be opened up is what if the community owns the holiday accommodation? What if the community owned, rather, you've got community-owned housing, you've got something else that brings in an income?
I think that's what I was roughly driving at,
Yeah.
in a rather pedestrian way. I apologise. Um, how, how, how much actual control do you have in Tiree? I mean, are you part of Highland Council? What entity is looking after who levies the council tax? Is it
Um,
Highland?
Argyll and Bute.
Down and
So
Butte.
Argyll and Bute is our council. Yes. So unlike the Western Isles, for example, who have a Western Isles council, Corlin and Newland Shear,
Yeah.
we are part of Argyll and Bute.
Okay. So which is headquartered where now? I used to live in
Loch
Largs. I used
Gilpid,
to know it.
I think. Loch Gilpid, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, quite a ways from Tiree.
I mean,
If I
it's a very challenging constituency, Argyll and Bute, because you start in Helensburgh, you include Dunoon and Campbelltown, and all the way out to Tiree, and that is a lot to ask of any council to be able
yeah,
to effectively manage both big mainland populations and area and
yeah.
islands, all of which have their own logistical challenges. And I'm not sure personally that it's ideal. I'd love to see a move towards a sort of Inner Hebridean Islands Council or something that actually focuses on islands themselves.
I mean, when it comes to councils, it always struck me that Scotland was grossly over centralised. I mean, I felt it keenly when I lived in Largs. Uh, I was always uncertain. Let me try and be kind now. I was always uncertain about how much commitment that people in Perth had to a place that used to have its own council, and that was taken away. And I think at one time, Kinross, during a reorganisation, was offered to Fife, and Fife turned it down. And it was offered to Perth and Kinross. Maybe they weren't offered the choice of turning it down. So now it's run by Perth and Kinross Council, but the bulk of the councillors, of course, are located outside of Kinross, and just a handful of people representing. It always struck me that was a rather odd way to go about things. I mean, Scotland isn't a big country. There's only 5 million odd people. Why not have, as you say, a council that's local, that's close to you? Why do we need to have these great gargantuan entities trying to serve people across huge areas? I mean, what's wrong with having, a tiny and call council? I mean,
Give us the budget, yeah.
yeah,
I
give
don't
me
know. I
the
mean,
budget, and you get on with it.
yeah, we'd have to find some people probably to run it as well, because all of our volunteers are absolutely shattered. Um, but
But
yeah, it's an interesting one.
you would do what all councils do, Rhoda. You would go out and hire somebody.
Yeah, yes, then we have to find them a house.
Well, you could say as part of the deal, you could sweeten the pot here. Come on, work with me on this.
Bring your own house. Have you heard of digital nomads? It is an
It
interesting
seems
one
to
though,
be,
that
it seems to me if you're properly
centralization.
funded,
Yeah.
because so much that this comes down to funding and the way these funds are disbursed across the country. I always had a thought that once there was a Scottish Parliament in place, one of its priorities might be to decentralise and get rid of all the very large entities so that local people felt there was local control. Because the difficulty comes as soon as you make an entity very big, people lose that connection. It's inevitable. It's just geography is a cruel master when it comes to these sort of things. It always seems to me.
Yeah, and I would say that from this my perspective, certainly in the perspective of a lot of islanders I speak to, um, when it comes to issues that relate to island and rural communities, such as the housing challenges, the infrastructure challenges with ferries and connectivity, the depopulation, the loss of Gaelic culture and language, all of that, Holyrood is as far from us as Westminster is
Yeah,
on these issues. And there is a real centralization of power, but also a centralization. The knowledge is very urban and very centralized. You only had to look at the furore around the HPMAs last year in the fishing to see just how unaware the Central Belt were and Holyrood were about the complexities of that issue and how
Yeah,
important they are to an ecosystem in fragile places. And that whole situation could have been avoided if there had been an understanding that these places work differently and that
yeah,
you need to talk to people and get people involved and that one size doesn't fit all. And I think, again, the council tax, the short-term lets, it's a one size fits all, and
yeah,
it's where you get at the edges where we don't fit nicely into those boxes. That's
yeah.
where that size just doesn't work. So yeah, I'd agree with you. I've been very disappointed by the sort of centralization of everything.
It's a curse of the political system. Every political system, it seems to me, wants to centralize if left to its own devices, because there are always huge and compelling arguments to centralize. We can save money. We can get better use out of tax pounds if we get rid of this and get rid of that and bring everything together. And then all of a sudden it sets in motion a mindset that there's folks out there who need to be administered to. In other words, they cease to be part of the collective. They're people who need to be treated. And
Hmm.
occasionally they say things you don't agree with, but they need to understand that the majority is very important here. And that this is the mindset. It's not by no means peculiar to Scotland. Goodness gracious me, you know, every
Yep,
country in the world.
there've been people talking about, what about Highlands and Islands sort of breakaway? So that's the next phase, the Scottish independence, then independence for the Highlands and Islands, and on and on. And I think if there was independence for the Highlands and Islands, Tiree would still be forgotten about because Inverness would become the centre, for example, or Stornoway would be the centre for the islands. And yeah,
I think
there's
it's the
no.
wrong discussion. I think the discussion maybe ought to be independence for Tyree and Call. I mean, it's that independence for a whole big grouping doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense. I mean, and it's not easy. I mean, look at the United States; they were running now from 1776, and they're still not happy. The states think the Washington has far too much power. And there's a whole bunch of lazy so and so's in Washington D.C. who make all these decisions without really knowing what's going on. And the state and the Washington saying the states do the craziest things, left to their own devices. They would reintroduce prohibition. They would reintroduce slavery and all. So we have to have some central control. I know. So, I mean, these arguments are all solid and convincing, except that centralization tends to have a trajectory, a momentum all of its own, and you have to have some system in place. I'll tell you what. Here's a suggestion. Uh, Maybe write to the Scottish government and say, I've seen your draft constitution. I don't think it goes far enough. I think you should have a section in there about decentralisation, i.e., that power in an independent Scotland will categorically be devolved to the smallest possible entity. Now they're not going to agree to that, by the way, but anything that countervails against the centre, it seems to me is laudable because the centre has all the power and it will always have all the power left to its own devices. I mean, that's why the US decided to have a Senate and a House of Representatives and all sorts of other stuff like that. Because unless you put these things into place, you don't get the very things that we've been talking about, it seems to me. Let me
Yeah,
take you on
you
to
just got to
something
keep
else.
challenging it.
Just keep challenging it. I think that's the key. I do feel that's the right thing, and not to settle, because to me, justice is on your side. But I mean, you're taking on these centralization, is it centripetal forces? Yeah. Then you do. It's a hard job. It's a really hard job. Let me ask you a question about ferries, because ferries are always in the news. At least BBC Scotland would suggest that. How do you feel about the ferry service in your neck of the woods?
Oh, that's a dangerous, dangerous question, isn't it? Yeah, the ferries. No one. many questions. First and foremost, as an islander, the service that local CalMac staff give us is second to none. They are superb. And I think that's often forgotten in the argument. Local ports will do everything they can to get people on boats. They're just incredible and should be treated as such. The boats themselves, we know the story. It is a case of a complete failure to invest in rolling stock, essentially, and to see. I mean, this has to have been seen coming down the line. Trains don't last forever, buses don't last forever, boats don't last forever. So there was a complete failure to see that, or to deal with that, or to care about that. I don't know which bit of that it was, but the wing and the prayer has stopped working. It's an interesting one because I see online a lot of I'm a card-carrying independent supporter. I see a lot of people in that part of the Twitter sphere, saying that the ferry crisis is overblown. And yes and no, it gets a lot of column inches, and there's nothing that we can do about it in terms of the boat building and the decisions behind that right now. We just have to wait for the boats. But the impact of the failure to invest and then the complete failure in the management design or whatever has gone wrong in the project management of these boats has an enormous impact on island communities and individuals. And when you get down to it, it affects food arriving, it affects your GPs getting on and off the island, it affects school trips, it affects cancer treatment, it affects this huge impact. And so it is a really serious issue, and I think the biggest, the two I call them sort of ill-fated disaster tubs, one of which is at least floating now under our own steam. Put those on one side for a moment. The big issue, the underlying issue, was a chronic failure to take into account the needs of our more transport challenging communities until it was the last minute, because again, due to centralization, we're just out in the periphery there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, so a lot of people say, oh well, the cancellations are weather. Yeah, a lot of cancellations are weather, and very few of us would complain about that. It's a master's decision whether he goes out or not, and as islanders, we respect the sea. However, the older the boats get, the more often they are cancelled because of weather, because they are not fit to sail. So they are not, their thrusters aren't strong enough. They're not happy with the welding work. They know something's not quite right. And when it comes to a couple of the boats, for example, the Lord of the Isles or the Isle of Lewis right now, if anything happens to those two boats at all, the entire network just sort of crumbles like a pack of cards. So, it might be that 10 years ago that boat would have sailed in that weather. Well, now we've got a whole different set of variables to take into account. So it does all come back to that failure to invest in our island communities at a much, much earlier date.
And I guess it was much easier to overlook that need for investment if you're in the central belt, because you're not using the traffic except once in a while. You're using ferries once in a while, I suppose. Whereas if it was, I don't know, remodeling the M9 or the M8, it's hard to think that the same would have happened. And I may be doing a disservice now, and I apologize if I am, but it seems to me if there was a problem in the M8 or a potential problem or a prospective problem, then that gets lots of attention, and the M9 and the M90. It seems to me we're back to the same thing again, which is that the more local control you have, the more likely it is that you're going to get your needs met. For example, nobody in the islands would have left things in the way that you've described them. They wouldn't have done it. They would have said, look, we need to look ahead here. We need to look at the quality of the ships over the next 20, 30 years. It would have been axiomatic. No one would have paused. even not to consider it. They were going straight to it and say, what are we going to do about it? Where are we going to find the money? And I looked to Scandinavia and I looked at other places where ferries are commonplace. And they're always looking down the pike, if I can mix my metaphors, to say, what are we doing now? But
Absolutely.
again,
And
maybe
worst case scenario, you build a new boat every 5 years. So it's like the
precisely.
Klansman or whatever.
Yeah,
You have too much rolling stock, you sell it.
yeah,
It should be an automatic rolling program for what people need,
yeah,
And at the end of the day, the idea of tourism, Visit Scotland,
yeah,
very keen on sending people to the islands, good for tourism. But if you're sending people to the islands and in increasing numbers, the infrastructure has to be there.
yeah,
People don't just magically appear. So yeah.
yeah. It does seem to me that's important. So, despite all of that, and I should add one thing that maybe it's more than a Scottish issue. Maybe there's a British problem here, in that I gather the Royal Navy can't get its aircraft carriers out of the port for any length of time, and these cost a lot more than the ferries. But
They've got
no
enough
doubt.
problems. We'll leave the Navy to theirs.
Well, if they can afford money for these hugely expensive aircraft carriers, they can surely find a few bob to keep the ferries running. Um, but then again, that's a Westminster decision, not a Holyrood decision. So, despite all of these challenges, you still believe that independence is the best way forward.
I do. Yeah, absolutely.
Why is that?
Why is that? Because I take one look over the border and I know that I prefer the approach that we are taking in Scotland and that our government is taking in Scotland when it comes to all sorts of issues. And we're far, far from perfect. I think there's a real danger that we walk into that trap of Scottish exceptionalism and we're this and we're that and we're brilliant. We have huge challenges, yes, but I am more confident that we could meet those in a way that is best for Scotland if we are in charge. Full stop. Um,
Do you think if the Scottish independence were to happen, that the islands would get a better deal?
I'm not convinced. I honestly, that's the other side of the coin. Is I'm not convinced of that. Um, I think we'd have a better chance of it. I think we'd have a better chance of lobbying. I think it would be easier to not lobby two governments at once. I think the chances would increase of the islands getting a better deal. I think there'd be fewer places to run to and fewer excuses to be made when there is control of the entire budget. Um, that said, when it comes to island and rural communities, there have been a lot of decisions and lots of policy decisions that have been taken in recent years by the government, by our SNP government, that I have thought were deeply unhelpful at best. And so, I am an independent supporter, but I have been left sitting, going, I actually don't know where I belong. I know I believe in Scottish independence, but I'm watching my community being failed, and it's
Yeah,
an interesting place to sit in.
it'll need structural change, I expect, of the kind that we've discussed. There would have to be some constitutional commitment uh, placed on a future Scottish government that made care for island communities mandatory. In other words, not voluntary. Uh, and I think when you move to that basis, and it may not just be island communities, there may be other communities too that need to be included. But I think if you make it structural, i.e., it is not negotiable, it has to be in the budget. There's no scope for fooling around with the finances. That has to be committed and by every administration, regardless of its political sensibilities and sentiments, because it's a national priority as agreed by the people when they drew up their constitution. Now, it seems to...
Sorry, yeah, I'd absolutely agree. I think sometimes you see people say, "Oh well, that's just what you get for voting SNP." I don't believe in a million years we would be in a better situation with any other party either until such time, as you say, that there are new commitments have to be made in terms of how communities that are not so central are addressed.
Yeah. I can't see any way around it. I mean, you're right not to depend on other political parties. I mean, in my introductory remarks, I talked about John Simmons, head of the Labour think tank, who said on LBC that criminals, people traffickers, should be put on a barge and taken to Scotland. Now, with that degree of sensitivity, it's unlikely that the island communities form any part of his priorities.
We're only ever one thing or the other. We're either a wonderful idyllic escape that people want to go to, or we're used by politicians as some sort of penitentiary. It's it's only ever one or the other. There doesn't seem to be any kind of understand. We lose the understanding of the people just living their lives in the middle of it.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that would need to take place. I just say to some folks in the audience are concerned that their questions haven't been addressed. I think if you look back, you'll find that most of the questions have been covered. It's just that Rhoda, in her remarks, dealt with a lot of the issues that have cropped up, and some of them might be a little bit peripheral to the main discussion. But we do try and cover as many questions as possible. And if we don't, it's simply due to my ineptitude or the lack of time. And I can apologise for the first, but not the second, because we've only got Rhoda for an hour. And it would be onerous. I mean, she's trying to do a full-time job here. She wears at least 3 hats, if not 4. And we're taking up a whole hour of our busy life tonight. And I'm deeply grateful that you've been able to join us for that period of time. But it would be onerous to require you to spend much more time. Because we're almost out of time, we've just got a couple of 3 minutes, Rhoda. Are there any messages you would like to get out to the wider community that we haven't discussed tonight?
That's a good question. I've got plenty of things I could plug, but in terms of
Plug
topics,
away.
well, I think we've covered a lot of the key ones around island situations. I always encourage people whenever I talk to them to buy local or to buy shop small. And one of the projects that I run is called Scottish Island Gifts, and it's a Scottish Islands Etsy essentially, where we sell the best of products from the Scottish Islands, and that started during COVID. But what it does is it increases the off-season sales for people who rely on tourists during the summer. And there's some great things. So I would encourage you to look at that. And yeah, support small businesses in the islands, because one of the things we haven't talked about is resilience and our economies and building strong businesses that can also employ the people when they get their houses. So
yeah,
that's certainly a thing that I would encourage. And if you like tea, I have a tea label. It's called Tyree Tea. It would be remiss of me not to mention it. It's a delicious cuppa. Google me and you'll find it, and you'll never go back.
That's super. And people should also look out for your column in the National too.
Yes, I'm in the National on a weekly basis. You'll find me in the 7 days on Sunday.
Excellent.
I've just finished a crofting series, but I'm sure I'll find new topics.
Excellent. Rhoda, thank you very much. You've been more than kind with your time. Thank you for such an excellent discussion about island life and about being a techie as well, which is always fascinating to me. The fact that all of that can happen from Tyree and elsewhere, it's a fantastic. More power to your arm. And I hope some of these structural changes that we talked about are actually put into practice sometime soon. We've got an election coming up. And generally, when people are grubbing for votes, they tend to be more sensitive to local opinions. So good luck to you on that one. Okay. Thank you again.
We'll give it our best shot. Thank you, John.
Take care. I'm just going to make a few concluding remarks. Thank you again. I appreciate it. So there we are. Great guest, Rhoda Meek. And next week we've got another star guest coming up. Look out, by the way, for Rhoda's columns in the 7 Days and the Sunday National. And to all of you for joining us, thank you. Stay safe, take care, and keep the questions coming, because we may not have covered them tonight, but I expect we probably will do in future shows. And also, last but by no means least, look out for the crowdfunder for Indie Live. Take care, stay safe, goodbye, and good night.